"Sir, could you pretend to be my dad, just for one day?" The little girl pleaded with the CEO. It was Tuesday, late afternoon in Madrid. The sky held that coppery hue that comes just before the cold sets in, and El Retiro Park seemed to have slowed down. Emilio Herrera was on the same bench as always. Impeccable suit, Swiss watch, unflappable expression. He had everything except time to waste. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he didn't answer. It was the only moment of the week he allowed himself to be alone, or pretend to be. That's when he felt something tug at his sleeve. At first he thought it was a mistake, or a beggar. He glanced to the side, annoyed. But he froze when he saw who it was. A little girl, shaking. She wore a coat far too thin for the cold. Her eyes were large and glossy, and her voice barely came out when she spoke. "Sir, could you pretend you're my dad?" It wasn't a game. It wasn't a joke. She was desperate. Emilio took a few seconds before answering. He tried to brush her off with a polite but firm gesture. She persisted. "Just for today." Her eyes shone with fear and hope at the same time. He noticed her hands were ice cold, her face dirty, her gaze charged with an urgency he couldn't name. "My mom," she said, her voice breaking. "She's in the hospital. She's leaving." Emilio's throat went dry. He tried to ask where her father was, but she answered before he could speak. "I never had one. She just wanted me to meet one, even if it was only for a day." Silence. Emilio looked around. No one seemed to notice. The world went on, indifferent to that absurd request, or perhaps to the most human one of all. He didn't know why he said yes, but he did. He stood up and held out his hand. The girl grabbed it as if she were drowning. They walked side by side, in silence. Emilio walked as if he were heading to a business meeting, stiff and distant. The girl, by contrast, seemed to find safety there, as though this cold man were the anchor life had denied her. On the way to the hospital, she began to talk. She said her name was Isabella, 5 years old. She loved to draw. She liked stars. She knew her mother was going to die, but she pretended she didn't, and every Tuesday, for months, she'd sit with her mom on the other side of the park to watch him. "My mom said you looked like a real dad, even without smiling." Something inside him melted. Emilio, the man who never wanted children, who never cried, who never got involved, began to feel something different. A discomfort that wasn't pain, but wasn't comfort either. They arrived at the hospital. Emilio hesitated at the entrance. The girl squeezed his hand. "She'll be so happy to see you." They went up. In the room, the air smelled of medicine and farewells. Still, Carmen smiled when she saw her daughter next to Emilio. She didn't ask who he was. There was no need. She just looked at the girl, then at him, and smiled as though she'd found peace. Emilio was speechless. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to say anything. He just stood there. Then he sat down. Carmen watched him, as if she'd always known him. It was as if he'd already been part of their story. By the end of that night on his way home, Emilio couldn't shake the sound of Isabella's voice, nor the warmth of her hand, nor Carmen's look. "Pretend you're my dad." He knew something had changed. He knew it wouldn't end there, and it didn't. The next morning, Emilio Herrera did something that wasn't on his schedule or in any protocol. He returned to the hospital. In his hands was a bag with juice and cookies, a random choice from someone who's never had to think about what a child might like to eat. He slipped into the room quietly. Isabella smiled when she saw him and ran to him as if she'd been waiting there all along. Carmen was awake, but weak. Her eyes were sunken, her body sunk into the mattress. Still, when she saw Emilio there, she showed no surprise, only a serene nod, as if this moment had been foreseen. As her daughter talked, Carmen watched. There was a kind of relief in her eyes, the sort of peace a mother feels when she knows somehow that her child won't be completely alone. Isabella couldn't stop talking. She showed drawings, told stories, shared bits of her world. Emilio found himself sitting on the hospital floor, listening to tales of stars, rainbows, and invisible planets, as if they were the most important things in the universe. And maybe they were. After Isabella left the room to fetch more paper, silence fell, but it was heavy with unspoken words. Carmen looked at him calmly. He didn't know what to say. He didn't need to. She already knew everything. For months, she and Isabella had watched him from the bench on the other side of the park. Same time, every Tuesday, Carmen had told her daughter he seemed like the kind of man who, even without smiling, carried something good inside. And Isabella believed it. For a girl who'd never had a father, hope was enough. Imagining was enough. Seeing someone who looked steady enough to be real was enough. Carmen didn't ask for explanations, didn't judge, didn't question why he'd come back. She just looked grateful. Grateful for the gesture, for the time, for his presence. On the wall, taped up, was one of Isabella's drawings. 3 people under a blue sky, mother, daughter, and the dad who appeared. None of their faces were detailed, but the man wore a suit, and he was holding the other 2's hands tightly. In that picture, Emilio wasn't a stranger. He was part of them. In that picture, he was someone. When he left the hospital that night, Emilio walked slowly through Madrid's streets. His phone rang 4 times. He ignored it. Traffic, noise, the city's rhythm all carried on as usual, but something inside him wasn't where it had always been. For the first time, the luxurious silence of his own apartment felt unsettling. He thought of Carmen, her strength that didn't ask for help, yet gave thanks anyway. He thought of Isabella, how she held his hand, how she trusted him without promises or guarantees. He had given nothing, but somehow he was already being treated as everything, and that frightened him more than any shareholders' meeting, any billion-dollar decision, any flaw in the reports. There, facing a 5-year-old girl and a mother on a countdown, Emilio began to understand what he'd never had the courage to feel: bond. The next morning, Emilio arrived at the hospital before visiting hours. He asked permission at the desk. "I'm family," he said. The receptionist hesitated, but when she saw his face, steady but worn, she simply nodded. Isabella waited for him with a sheet of paper in her hand. It was a schedule, drawn in pencil, with little boxes and crooked arrows mapping out the day's activities. At the top, it said, "Daddy's Day." He looked at the paper and smiled for the first time in weeks, a small, unpracticed but genuine smile. The room became a kind of parallel world. Emilio spent the day there, sitting on the floor atop a thin blanket, helping Isabella paint. She asked questions and answered for him, invented imaginary conversations, made silly faces, laughed easily. Carmen watched in silence, the kind of silence that holds both relief and sorrow. Throughout the day, Emilio discovered little things. Isabella slept with a scented cloth. She was afraid of the dark, but pretended to be brave. She wanted to be an astronaut, but also a doctor. And she believed that when a star shines extra bright, it means someone is thinking of her. When she fell asleep late that afternoon, Carmen asked him to stay a little longer. The room's light was dim. The monitor's beeps were constant. Emilio sat beside her bed. She looked more tired than the day before. Her eyes drooped. She didn't speak of goodbyes or pain. She spoke of her daughter, of the day she first heard her sing, when she lost her first tooth, how guilty she felt for not being able to give her a future. She said she'd tried to be everything: mother, father, home, shelter. But now she needed to ask something that terrified her, to ask someone to replace her. She didn't say the word adoption. She didn't demand promises. She only asked, her voice shaking, "Do you think you can love her?" As if she were your own. Emilio took a long moment to answer, because the answer was a shock. Because that feeling he'd always avoided was now sitting next to him, breathing the same air. "I think I already do," he said, without quite hearing himself. Carmen closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek without drama. It was relief. It was peace. Hours later, when Emilio left the hospital, he realized he'd spent the entire day there, without checking his phone, without thinking of the company, without reports, mergers, or board meetings. In that small room with two people he barely knew, he'd found something he never knew he was searching for: a purpose. It was before sunrise on the third day when Emilio Herrera arrived at the hospital. He didn't know why he'd been in such a hurry. It wasn't like him. Maybe because he knew time in that place didn't follow the rules of the world outside. Carmen was awake, weaker still, breathing with difficulty, but she still found the strength to smile when she saw her daughter asleep beside her, curled up under a colorful blanket. Emilio stood watching for a moment, then stepped forward. Carmen didn't ask why he'd come back. She only looked him in the eye as if to say, "I know." So much remained unspoken between them, but the essential was already clear. It was there, in that room full of silence and shallow breaths, that Emilio spoke. No flourish, no rehearsal, with the same cold precision he used to announce billion-dollar decisions, but with an emotion even he couldn't control. "I want to adopt her." Carmen took a moment to react, not out of doubt, but from the impact of his words. He was no longer the stranger on the park bench. He was the man holding her daughter's world in his arms without even knowing it. She drew a deep breath, looked at Isabella still asleep, then back to Emilio. "Just promise me one thing." He waited. "Never erase who I was. Tell her about me. Make sure she sees me, even when I'm gone." He nodded, eyes wet, voice thick. "You'll be in everything." That night, Carmen's condition worsened. The doctors already knew. Emilio knew too. He stayed. For the first time, he turned off his phone, sat by her bed, and held her hand. He said nothing. He simply stayed until her final breath. 3 days later, Emilio held Isabella's hand at the funeral. She wore white, just as her mother had asked. In her other hand was the same drawing. The three of them, hands joined beneath a rainbow. During the ceremony, she turned to him. "Will you still stay with me?" He looked down at her, so small, so strong, so full of questions no 5-year-old should ever have to ask. "Forever," he answered. And for the first time, he understood the weight and the beauty of those two words. 6 months passed. Emilio's apartment no longer felt the same. Where everything had once had its place, in neat grey silence and predictability, there were now taped-up drawings on the walls, forgotten toys on the living room floor, and a constant faint smell of slightly burnt cookies in the oven. Isabella. She filled every corner with a lightness that was impossible to ignore. Up before dawn, she'd sit with him at breakfast, telling dreams that mixed dragons with space stations. At night, she'd beg for stories, fully aware Emilio was making them up on the spot. Sometimes she'd correct him. "That ending is boring, Daddy." And he'd try again. "Yes, Daddy." She took to calling him that as naturally as breathing, no ceremony, and he never corrected her. In the first days, Emilio tried to keep up his CEO routines, remote meetings, calls with directors, presentations to shareholders. But everything felt distant. He was still competent, still respected, but a piece of him stayed home, on that living room rug, amid colored pencils and bunny ear slippers. Sometimes Isabella would wake crying, calling for her mother. He'd rush in, sit by her bed, hold her hand. "I'm here." And he'd stay until her tears turned back into sleep. Other times, she'd talk about her mother with joy, a song she used to sing, a favorite meal, a gentle gesture. Carmen wasn't a taboo, she was a presence. Emilio didn't speak of her often, but he listened, and that was enough. He learned that love is built through repetition, by remembering to say good morning even when you're in a hurry, by asking if she liked her snack, by sitting still and watching cartoons you don't understand just because she wants the company. There were hard days. Isabella asked painful questions. Why did mommy leave? Why do other kids have a mom and dad and I only have you? And he answered as best he could with the gentlest truth he could find. Because life wanted it this way, and because I chose you. She accepted it and hugged him tight. The pain didn't vanish, but it found room to breathe. Emilio didn't become a different man. He became himself, for the first time. Now he saw meaning in the small things. He knew time was far too precious to waste on anything that didn't touch the heart. And in that new home, messy, alive, noisy, Emilio discovered that love doesn't arrive in an explosion. It's built slowly, every single day. 5 years passed. Isabella was now 10. She'd grown quickly, in height, in ideas, in feelings, but she'd kept her sweetness. She still painted stars. She still talked to her mother before bed, and she still called Emilio Daddy with the same sparkle in her eyes she'd had at 5. That morning, Emilio walked her to his office. It was a special occasion. The staff all knew. He'd told them, "Today I have an important meeting with someone even more important." Isabella padded through the hallways with her backpack on, her hair held back by 2 colorful markers used as makeshift barrettes, a folded sheet of paper in hand. She moved like she owned the place. People smiled at her. Some, discreetly, wiped away a tear. After all, everyone knew the story, and everyone had noticed how their boss had changed since that little girl had come into his life. She stopped in front of Emilio's desk and handed him the paper with pride. "It's my school assignment. Topic: what happens when a star dies?" He unfolded it. A short, precise paragraph. Firm, childlike handwriting. "Even when a star dies, its light keeps traveling through space. It still shines, even after it's gone. My mother was like that. Her light still guides me, and always will." Beneath it, a drawing. Isabella and Emilio holding hands, and Carmen in the sky, hair loose in the wind, smiling down at them. Emilio couldn't speak. He just took a steadying breath, holding back whatever emotion threatened to spill from his eyes. Isabella sat in the chair beside his desk. "Do you think she still watches over us?" He paused a moment. "I think she does." "Me too." They fell silent after that, but it wasn't a silence weighed down by grief. It didn't demand an answer. It was the kind of quiet that exists only between people who've learned to love after losing. That evening, as they did every evening, they lit a candle, not for mourning, but for gratitude. Gratitude that they'd found each other. Gratitude that she'd chosen to believe. Gratitude that Carmen, without knowing it, had left them the map to become a family. Night. In Emilio's apartment, their routine hummed in a peaceful hush. Crumbs dotted the kitchen table. An open notebook displayed a science assignment surrounded by star doodles. On the couch, forgotten bunny ear slippers. On the walls, the same drawings as always, now more refined, but still carrying that childlike trace of hope. Isabella lay tucked in, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. "Daddy? Do you think true parents are those who bring us into this world, or those who choose to stay?" He took his time answering. "I think true parents are those who choose to love. Every single day, even when it's hard." She smiled. "Then you're my real dad." Emilio leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You've been my daughter since the moment you grabbed my hand on that bench. I just needed a little time to realize it. She closed her eyes but kept whispering, "I love you more than the stars." He answered without skipping a beat, "And I love you more than everything between them." In the corner of the room, the candle flickered. It was their nightly ritual, lit in Carmen's name, not out of sorrow, but as a symbol, as if to say, "You're still here." Emilio watched the flame dance and thought of everything. The little girl who appeared out of nowhere and disarmed him with a single request. The woman who, even in leaving, left behind a legacy of unconditional love. The transformation that didn't come from books, contracts, or victories, but from affection, a love built not by obligation, but by choice. Beside the candle, he noticed another drawing he hadn't seen before. He only saw it when he blew out the light. 3 figures holding hands, as always. Now Carmen stood between them, smiling. Above was a caption in purple marker: "Those who choose to love never really leave." Emilio sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, and stayed there for a while, listening to his daughter's breathing, feeling the candle's warmth, thinking that in the end, this was all that mattered: being present, choosing to stay, and keeping alive the memory of the one who taught us what it means to love every single day.